zoom in a little better. So now it looks like the YouTube channel is streaming. We can begin the meeting after I unmute.
Got a couple of guests. Who are the guests? I don't know. We don't have room really for them, I don't think. Good, good. Nabil, we need Nabil.
We need the bills, so we need. يا نبيل تفضل.
Mark, do you want to get into the table so you could be on the camera when you're asking questions or making comments?
Just have fun.
Okay. Nabil, do you?
Well, he said he can't really get beyond us.
Okay.
Are we ready? Good afternoon and welcome to the Middle East Policy Council's 82nd Policymakers Conference. We're streaming live to you from the Council's offices in Washington, D.C. Before I get into the program, let me just mention that if you wish to follow us on Twitter, you can follow us at Mideast Policy, MIDEEASTPOLICY. My name is Richard Schmier. I'm a member of the board of the Middle East Policy Council and very pleased to be able to moderate today's discussion. The Capitol Hill Conference Series goes back many decades. As I mentioned, this is our 82nd iteration of the conferences, and it's one of the three primary activities of the Middle East Policy Council. The Council itself is a nonprofit educational organization. It was founded in 1981. In addition to the Capitol Hill conferences, the Council publishes a quarterly journal, the Middle East Policy, and in that journal appears a transcript of each of our Capitol Hill conferences. And then the third flagship program of the Council is our educational outreach activities, which engages students, educators, civic leaders, and others on educational issues involving the Middle East. The mission of the Council is to contribute to America's understanding of the political, economic, and cultural issues that affect U.S. interests in the Middle East. I'm very pleased today to be able to open this conference, which is entitled 1 Year Later, Assessing the Coalition Campaign Against ISIS. And with me today I have four distinguished guests who will be speaking on these issues. Brian Katulis, who is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where his work focuses on U.S. national security policy in the Middle East and South Asia. Brian has done previous work in the Middle East, in particular for the National Democratic Institute. He publishes regularly in major newspapers, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, as well as in our journal, Middle East Policy. Our second speaker today will be Siwar Al-Assad, who is the managing director of Alamiya TV and director of ANN Satellite Television. He's also the vice president of the United Nationals Democratic Alliance, which is an organization which seeks to promote justice, peace, and freedom in the international community. Our third speaker is William Morris, who is the Secretary General of the Next Century Foundation. He's also, like me, a fan of the Sultanate of Oman, where I had the pleasure of serving previously. The foundation operates in conflict zones and primarily is involved in Track 2 types of diplomacy to try to foster understanding and reconciliation in such areas. They've been involved in Iraq, Kashmir, Kosovo, Sudan, Egypt, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and Libya. And finally, we have our discussant, who is Dr. Tom Mater. Tom is the Executive Director of the Middle East Policy Council. He's had a distinguished teaching career at various universities, including Kent State, the University of Southern California, the University of California at Riverside, and Cornell University. He previously worked with the Council as our research director. His publications include books on the UAE and Iran. With that, let me turn it over to our first panelist, Brian Katulis, with your opening remarks.
Great. Thank you, Richard. And it's nice to be here at the offices of the Middle East Policy Council. Before I go into my formal presentation, I wanted to make two main points. And one is just a commentary on the format here today, and a hope that we're now being live streamed, and I hope anyone who's watching this, we have the technical capability to take questions to make this a dialogue. I'm disappointed in the format not being what we expected, but we all adjust. And I'm disappointed also that our friend from the Kurdistan Regional Government is not here, but I live up to my commitment and hope to make my views clearly known. And I hope those of you who may be watching in this forum have an opportunity to express yourself as well and ask questions, because I think it's through dialogue that we're only going to get to the bottom of issues of how do we actually stabilize the Middle East and defeat ISIS. The second thing I wanted to say, and Tom from the Middle East Policy Council reached out to me last month after I testified to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee looking at the campaign against ISIS 1 year into it. And I'm a policy analyst here. I go to the region once a month or so and try to conduct research and shape the debate and dialogue here. But I think sometimes it's in forums like this and in antiseptic conference rooms like this from Washington, D.C., it's easy to get disconnected from the human tragedy. And I think it's important just to note that as we sit here today and as we have this discussion, and my aim is to help try to find a pathway towards peace and stability in Syria and Iraq and the broader region. As we sit here today, people are being murdered. Tens of thousands of people are being murdered. Inside of Syria, most of those deaths are committed by the regime, by the government, and brutal barrel bombings. Many of the deaths are caused by terrorist organizations and extremist groups. The deaths that we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years is just the beginning. If you add up the sense of injustice, the indignity that people in Syria and people in Iraq have felt for decades at the hands of rulers that did not respect their basic rights, and this is decades. If we don't recognize this as the basic human dimension here, all of our policy discussions will be disconnected from that reality. So my remarks, Richard and Tom and others, I wanted to make two main points structured around my overall assessment of the anti-ISIS campaign. And then second, a brief analysis on the broader regional security and political context for this campaign. I'll close with a couple of thoughts on how the coalition is doing, Iraq, and then also in Syria, those three main points. But I hope we have a dialogue, and I hope those people who wanted to come to this forum today have an opportunity to express their voice, whatever it may be. First, at the outset, my bottom to contain ISIS. I'm a U.S. policy analyst. My frame of reference is what does U.S. policy do? The next U.S. president will inherit this problem of ISIS, but the coming year offers an opportunity to make important course corrections. The United States mounted this anti-ISIS campaign last year in reaction to the group's surprising advances in Iraq and Syria in the summer of 2014. This campaign has helped key partners in Iraq and some countries in the region, like Jordan, develop a more effective response to the group's rise. Nonetheless, the campaign has not moved beyond a mix of tactical setbacks and tactical successes. The primary reason for this incomplete result 1 year into the campaign is that there is no single country that has made the anti-ISIS campaign its #1 priority. The Obama administration's #1 priority in the region over the past year was securing a diplomatic deal with Iran on its nuclear program. The fact that the administration and Congress have not been able to develop a consensus on the authorization for the use of force, more than 1 year since we've been using force in theater, suggests that the anti-ISIS campaign has not been a leading priority for those in Congress as well. Key regional partners in the anti-ISIS coalition, including Saudi Arabia, shifted their focus just months into the anti-ISIS campaign and diverted resources to Yemen. The actions of a number of countries in the region, like Turkey, indicate that they also don't see the ISIS threat as their top priority. The actions of Turkey indicate that they see a bigger threat from Kurdish separatist groups and the Assad regime in Syria than they do from the terrorist groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda affiliate al-Nusra. But now that the nuclear deal is completed, there is an opportunity to shift the focus and to enhance regional stability. The increased activity of countries like Russia and their bombing campaign in support of the Assad regime in Syria, I assess, is not likely to lead to greater stability. It's going to cause greater bloodshed and fragmentation and death. A second key reason for the incomplete results in this campaign is the lack of capable and reliable ground forces that are motivated and equipped to counter ISIS effectively. Again, our framework here is to look at the anti-ISIS campaign. This, I conclude, does not mean that the United States or any other outside actor should send in ground troops into Iraq and certainly not Syria. Rather, we should learn the lessons from this past year, especially that the need to develop reliable and capable partners motivated to counter ISIS takes a long time. It's very much connected also to the internal political dynamics, which is the third reason why I think the incomplete results of this anti-ISIS campaign are as they are at this moment. There has not been sufficient attention to the political and power-sharing dynamics that have given rise to the sense of injustice, grievance, and indignity among large sectors of the populations in both Iraq and Syria. I have my own views on what are those formulas for Iraq and Syria, which I'll provide towards the end. But plain and simple, groups like ISIS have fed off the dynamic and exploited the political vacuums in key parts of Iran's destabilizing regional role. In essence, the United States needs to have a much more clearer, compelling, and proactive strategy for engagement in the Middle East than we've seen over the last decade, which has been largely reactive, ad hoc, and crisis management. The recent proposals by the Obama administration to increase security cooperation and military transfers to partners in the region in the wake of the Iran deal merit some close consideration and must be analyzed in the context of what can be done to stabilize both Iraq and Syria. Sending arms without having a much more integrated political and diplomatic strategy for the region could actually end up contributing to greater fragmentation than we've already seen. My second big point is that the context for this anti-ISIS campaign is a broader and deeper historical context, that the Middle East's shifting environment today is very much related to a crisis of political legitimacy. The ongoing efforts in Iraq and Syria are part of a broader transformation in the Middle East. The region, essentially in the last 4.5 years, has entered an unpredictable and fluid period of transition involving increased competition of influence among key countries and the growing power of non-state actors, including extremist groups like ISIS. The region's top powers are engaged in a multipolar and multidimensional struggle for influence and power. This competition is multipolar because it includes the Shia-Sunni sectarian divisions, which only seem to have been accentuated in the last few months by the actions of both Iran and other countries, and is deeply connected to a regional architecture and a set of regional powers that have actually been using their resources to kill, murder, and fragment the countries of Syria and Iraq and the people in those countries. A core part of the challenge and the answer to this current regional dynamic is this crisis of political legitimacy for some of the major states in the region, including the current regime in Syria. Some governments lack support and a sense of allegiance from key sectors of their populations. They've lost it, plain and simple. They've lost the basic right to rule their people in part because of their own actions through decades of murder and repression. This political legitimacy crisis is linked to these governments' failures, and groups are reacting. Groups like ISIS have exploited this lack of political legitimacy that have thrived and that have emerged over decades, and again, because of the actions of regimes in the region for decades. A central part, in my view, of the long-term strategy for ISIS in stabilizing the Middle East must involve some forward thinking about the possible governance structures that would most likely succeed in providing justice, law and order, and vital services while also enjoying the popular legitimacy of the people. Breakup of these countries. Past experience of international actors trying to delineate new borders without the consent of the people, or try to pick leaders who appoint themselves from the outside without the consent of their people, have contributed to the problems that we have in the Middle East today. Rather, the long-term strategy for stability in the Middle East will require the use of force against radical extremist groups, and in some cases, I think, illegitimate regimes. And it will require, at a later phase, extensive negotiations about the balance of power within key countries, including Iraq and Syria. In Iraq, that discussion has been ongoing for much of the past decade, and there's a much clearer pathway forward than there is in Syria today. Very briefly, and I'll close with my opening remarks, a couple of points on the anti-ISIS coalition. In brief, I think the Obama administration took some very important steps in building a very large coalition of more than 60 countries to try to combat ISIS along 5 lines of effort: providing military support to key partners; second, impeding the flow of foreign fighters; third, stopping ISIS's finance and funding; fourth, addressing humanitarian crises in the region; and fifth, exposing the true nature of ISIS. In addition to building this coalition, the United States has worked with relevant international organizations, including the United Nations, to structure the dialogue at developing a much more effective response along these 5 lines of effort. Overall, the coalition, as I mentioned at the outset, has not achieved the results that it could have in the first year of its campaign. We need much more effort to strengthen and coordinate all components of the campaign. Much of the campaign's focus has been on military means, and particular an air campaign, without a broader diplomatic and political framework for those discussions. I'm sure our talk here and our discussion will talk about who are the likely partners and what is the likely formula for stability in both Iraq and Syria. 2 other points, one on Iraq and one on Syria. In Iraq, I think we've seen in the first year mixed results and an opportunity to move forward in the coming year. The center of gravity for U.S. policy in Iraq, in the campaign against ISIS, has been in Iraq. It's the place where the United States has had the greatest room to maneuver militarily and diplomatically. Many people in this room served many years in Iraq and know the country very well. Some of the lessons that we should have learned over the last couple of years inside of Iraq, and particularly over the last year, is that the internal political dynamics can be shaped and influenced to achieve more positive political outcomes, but within limits. The fact that the United States last summer, with other partners in the region, created incentives to motivate Iraq's leaders to make leadership changes, including their prime minister and key changes in their ministries, demonstrates that we can achieve results, but it's going to be a long slog. In the coming year, Iraq, I think, has many assets and structures in place that Syria does not. The United States has a deeper and much more extensive knowledge in Iraq, and we should continue this effort to degrade and ultimately defeat ISIS in Iraq, but with a focus on what can we do to help Iraqis create the most sustainable governance structures inside their own country. This needs to be negotiated. That means the continuation of a discussion that has gone on essentially since 2003. Lastly, in Syria, the U.S. policy in Syria, I think, is in need of a major course correction. The current state of affairs in Syria is dismal. The structure of overall conflict remains increasingly fragmented. I think the interventions by Russia and the reported interventions by Iran are unlikely to actually achieve greater stability inside of Syria. The Assad regime in Damascus, with support from its regional actors like Iran and Hezbollah, have been able to remain in power long after many people have predicted. This does not mean that I think they have the legitimacy to actually bring stability to that country. A couple of lessons from the past year on Syria. Number one, building alternative armed forces opposed to ISIS is difficult and cannot be done half-heartedly and must be connected to a wider long-term strategy to produce peace and stability. This U.S. effort that we've all read about to build an armed opposition to ISIS has not succeeded, and it has not had a discernible impact on the overall structure of the conflict in Syria. The airstrikes the United States and others have conducted have had some limited targeted impact on the movement and may have eliminated some terrorist threats, but it actually has not contributed to greater stability inside of Syria. Another lesson is that ISIS is a leading terrorist challenge, but it's not the only one. Clearly, Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate, has been engaging in terrorism, and also quite clearly, the Assad regime has been terrorizing its population for years. Again, my view is that the Assad regime and anyone closely associated with it, because of its brutal actions not only over the last 4 years, but over the last decades, have delegitimized it in the eyes of the vast majority of Syrians. This is why the vast majority of Syrians are out of the country or displaced. The majority of the deaths in Syria are a result of the Assad regime's actions. I think it should be a goal to salvage key government institutions that are part of the current Syrian government. It should be an objective, but we should be very careful about who we're willing to deal with. We should be very careful about being naive about those who claim they can stabilize the country of Syria by working with the current leadership of Syria. The continued breakdown of Syrian institutions will only accelerate the country's fragmentation, and the things that many UN envoys, like the current UN envoy or the previous one, Lakhdar Brahimi, have tried to do in negotiating and having a discussion about what does the composition of a transitional council look like in Syria is a very important discussion, but we need to be very careful about who we work with, because if we pick people or individuals who have been seen or are associated with those who have committed war crimes, who have murdered thousands of people, the process will backfire and blow up. In conclusion, in Syria and Iraq and the overall campaign against ISIS, I think the Obama administration took a couple of steps in the right direction in Iraq. It did a good thing in building a coalition with partners in the region, but because other priorities in the region, including the Iran nuclear deal, outweighed the anti-ISIS campaign, we've not seen the results that I think we could. To me, the essence of the discussion needs to center around, and I hope we have this discussion today, diplomacy. Who are the right actors that we actually should work with? In my view, conflicts like Iraq and Syria will not unless we marginalize all of those extremist voices that have committed the crimes over the past few years and build a sense of justice and accountability for past crimes. Any sense of interim solutions that are built upon working with actors and individuals that have done so much harm to their own people will ultimately crumble and will feed this cycle of extremism and terrorism that I think we've seen over the last few years. Thank you.
Well, Brian, thank you. Certainly given us a lot to think about, but I know our other two panelists also have a lot to contribute. So why don't we move right on, Siwar, and you could deliver your opening remarks.
Thank you. I belong to an organization called the United Nations Democratic Alliance. It's an opposition organization, mainly in Syria. We call for a gradual and peaceful change in Syria, and this actually call have been made 20 years ago by this organization that I do represent today. ISIS, the so-called ISIS, is a terrorist organization, and terrorism is not an organization. Terrorism is an ideology. The ideology of ISIS is perverted, is a very dangerous ideology. And I think it's more dangerous than the Nazis in the 30s. And I think the world is not doing enough to stop this tsunami that the people of the region, especially Syria and Iraq, are seeing, and they have to deal with it on a daily basis. Now ISIS, it's not only people with machine guns and beards who kill everybody who are different to them. ISIS is also people who can wear a suit and a tie, who can be in the United States or Europe or everywhere. They have different names. Some of them can be called the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is the mother, one of the mothers of ISIS. So the idea is that we need to combat an ideology, a very dangerous ideology. Now, what have been made so far? What have we seen so far? Who is fighting ISIS today? Before the Russian intervention, we have seen the Syrian army and the Iraqi army and the Kurdish forces fighting against ISIS on a daily basis, and fighting also against other rebel groups, Al-Qaeda affiliated, like Al-Nusra or so many other also units. And again, it's very confusing because they have different names, and every day we hear about a new little army funded by a foreign government or a group of people who live in exile. Therefore, we needed. It's very welcome. The American airstrikes that started more than a year ago are very welcome. They are a sign of good intentions, but it is not enough. Airstrikes, we cannot defeat terrorism from the sky. It's impossible. We have tried this. The history taught us that this was impossible. We've seen the results in Libya. It's chaos, and we don't want Syria to become like Libya, because it would be a real disaster for the entire region, for all the countries of the region. We have the minorities as well in Syria who are extremely worried. They have been living together for hundreds of years, and they like this diversity of languages, of ethnicities, of religions, of cultures. So different people who speak different languages in a very small area when you look at it. Even at the time of Jesus Christ, there was more than 60 languages spoken in a very, very small area in Lebanon and Palestine. These people need to be reassured. Today, the state of Syria, led by President Bashar al-Assad, is clearly supported, whether we like it or not, by many people in Syria. But these people who are supporting him, even these people who are supporting him, who have many differences, they do not want to see a comeback to pre-February 2011. So basically, even these people who are dying today, every day fighting against fanatics and terrorists, they want reforms, and they want, once the war is finished, they want to see things changing. They fight under the leadership of President Bashar al-Assad because apparently he is able to have them all fight together a common enemy. So they see in him a leader for now. The foreign policy of the United States is confusing in Syria, but not only this. I think everything is confusing. All the policies are confusing in Syria, because we see people fighting each other and doing business together in the same time. We see people killing each other and buying oil from each other and selling other things. So we have seen so many calls for President Assad to step down. He clearly has not responded. I think it is time now, after more than 4 years, to understand that he will not answer these calls. So we need to have priorities, and we need to be pragmatic. If the priority is a regime change, then we have to have a certain policy. If the priority is fighting the so-called ISIS, then we have to have different ideology. And if we need to fight ISIS, if we see that to succeed we need to deal with the people who are in charge on the ground, in this case one of them is President Bashar al-Assad, then why not? I really think that airstrikes, as I said, is not enough. They have to be in tandem with ground troops if we really want to achieve something. Now, I know that many times people were armed and trained by Western powers, and I think we have seen now that it was a mistake, that so much money was spent, and this was not successful because these people who were armed ended up giving their weapons or selling their weapons or even joining terrorist groups and Al-Qaeda affiliates. It's very difficult to make the distinction between a potential terrorist and a non-terrorist in Syria, even for Syrian people. So how can an American person or a French or an English person make the difference? It's very, very difficult. For now, we have the Russian airstrikes. The Russian airstrikes, I have heard comments, many people are against, many people are for the airstrikes, but the reality is that we are seeing the army of the Syrian state advancing on the ground. This army is advancing against ISIS. Many ISIS forces are being destabilized because of the strikes. Even in the city of Raqqa, we have seen videos of ISIS fighters running away and escaping. We've heard that many ISIS elements have crossed the border and they went to Turkey. Many of them went to Iraq. So in a way, we have seen positive results because these airstrikes are being. There is a coordination with ground troops, Kurdish forces, Iraqi army, and Syrian army. So it is in a way efficient. Now, with regards to solutions, we in an ideal world, we would like all the great powers, and of course the number one great power is the United States. We would like to see all these governments and the regional player sit together and agree on what the priorities are and work to achieve a very specific goal, and we think that we will see a positive result very quickly if everybody agree, because it's very easy in a way to cut the funding of the so-called ISIS. It's very easy to close the Turkish border. It's very easy to coordinate when it comes to satellite pictures and drones and airstrikes and ground troops. This will lead essentially to political reforms in Syria. A transitional government made of opposition forces and government forces. And this is what we have been, my organization have been calling for more than 20 years now, a gradual and peaceful transition. This is the only way we can see change in Syria. I am very optimistic, and I've heard today as well that the Russians and the United States have reached an agreement on fighting ISIS in Syria. So I think we need to wait and see what happens in the next month or two, but definitely Syria will change, and Syria will become a better place. Thank you.
Siwa, thank you very much for
Thank you.
your comments, which obviously introduced a number of additional issues, giving us a lot to talk about. Why don't we move now to William, and I know you've been involved in Track 2 and other activities, so you could tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll start our discussion.
Thank you. A word about ISIS's ideology first. ISIS is a millennialist group, a group that believes these are the days of Armageddon. It has a very strong following throughout the Sunni Arab world. It believes that the world is divided into Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. That's the House of Islam and the House of War, the world of Islam and the world of war. It regards everybody who is not part of their ideological approach as takfir. It's a word that comes from the word kafir. It means infidel. They based much of their ideology on the writings of a man, a Saudi, called Yusuf al-Ayyari, who was killed in 2003. They oppose currently the Muslim Brotherhood. They regard them as sinners because they have involved themselves in democracy. They regard democracy as sin. Their main young ideologue is the 33-year-old Turki al-Bin Ali, who is Bahraini, and he is their main thinker at the moment. Many of the people who have inspired ISIS foreign fighters are Westerners, Americans, Australians, British thinkers. And if you can track this, I could give you names if you wish. Their videos are on YouTube, and some of them have certainly the main American ideologue. He doesn't actually back ISIS, but his thinking, his spiritual thinking, is followed by ISIS thinkers, and his lectures have a huge following on YouTube. So these thinkers are up there. They are Westerners, and they're the ones that are inspiring the Westerners who join ISIS. It's similar in some ways as an ideology to Wahhabism, but it rejects the basic principle of Wahhabism, which is one ruler, one authority, and one mosque. The idea that the Saudi king is in some way the new caliph or whatever. They reject that. They believe that their caliphate is the only answer, and they oppose Saudi Arabia. They place a lot of value on the Dabiq hadith, which is a text, that is a prophecy that the final battle will take place in an area called Dabiq in northern Syria, and they are therefore they executed dear man Peter Kassig, that American, in Dabiq to make a symbolic gesture to say come and attack us. This is the place of the last battle. Al-Qaeda disowned them on the 2nd of February 2014. They were excommunicated partly because simply weren't interested in following any Al-Qaeda orders. Al-Qaeda had their own client group in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, and so they were very, very strong on not following the Al-Qaeda line. They have their young thinkers, and they are not interested in the old men that run Al-Qaeda. A word or two about this campaign we have against Daesh, ISIS. Daesh, it's called in the Arab world, ISIS in much of Europe. In America, you call it ISIL. It doesn't matter what you call it, but bombing has been, in my view, except when it's been in support of ground forces, bombing has been ineffective. We've seen this. I mean, how can you, bombing to liberate Kobani, you destroy 70% of the city of Kobani to liberate it. Is this the way forward? A lot of people have been made into refugees because of the bombing of us and our allies, and our many allies, and the shelling. I mean, there's one town that I've driven through often, just south of south of Baghdad, a little Sunni town. It no longer exists. It's been wiped off the face of the map by bombing. I don't know that bombing is changing the tide. The camps, it is atrocious. The conditions in the refugee camps are atrocious. I mean, unbelievably bad in some of these camps. And that is where ISIS recruits many of its fighters. If you're a young man living in the refugee camps in Turkey, or living as a refugee in Lebanon, what do you have? What future do you have? What life do you have? Better to go back and take $100 a month and fight for ISIS rather than the miserable pittance you will earn as a handout from the UN. They have no other way forward. We could do with actually some safe havens in the region. And I really do think that we need to think a little about that, because not everybody wants, people are being forced to flee because they have nowhere to go. And there is a possibility, for example, in the Nineveh Plain, there are little towns where there are a lot of refugees. Al-Kosh, for instance, or Bashika. Al-Kosh is a Christian town, Bashika is a Yazidi town. You could put a little money into building some housing project to house some of these refugees, and people would not want to flee. We need to care a little for the vulnerable, the very old, the very young. We need an end to the debathification laws, which were introduced by us, and for possibly good reasons. We put them in, but it's time to end them, because symbolically they are now interpreted as anti-Sunni. And the debathification laws in Iraq, it's no good tinkering with them. They have to be removed if we want to bring the Sunni community in Iraq on board with the idea that there should be some alternative to the ISIS group, which they do in large numbers support. It's no good pretending that they don't. We need to encourage the taking of prisoners. At the moment in this war, almost all prisoners are killed. And the Kurds have started recently to take prisoners. Almost all prisoners, obviously ISIS kills all its prisoners, but everyone kills all their prisoners. It's an interesting phenomena in terms of casualties. If any of you have been following the casualty figures from the Syrian war, in the early stages there were massive numbers of civilians killed. Not so now. Because why? Because most of the civilians in the areas where the worst fighting is taking place have fled. Of course they've fled. They're refugees. They've moved. And so the slaughter is actually of combatants, and it's on a big scale. And part of this it takes place because you have to fight to the death. If you're captured, you're killed. We need to encourage our own allies to take prisoners so that people who fight for ISIS think that there might be some benefit in surrendering in a ground battle. We need ruthless training, restructuring. There is a major problem with even the Kurdish elite forces, and certainly many of the forces. The point is, if you're an officer because you're from a good family. You're not an officer because you are a good commander. So this needs to change, and many of the forces are just militias. Even the Kurdish forces are split in. There's no unified command of the Kurdish forces, let alone any of the others. They're split into different groups, loyal to different leaders, totally independent one of the other. And we need to re-establish some sort of Sunni militia force, or force of some kind that is an alternative to ISIS. We'd set up good groups at one time in northern Iraq, but I'm sorry, but Maliki ruthlessly demolished the Sunni tribal leaders. Many of them died, and so there's no way forward, they feel, other than to back ISIS. So we need to provide backing for some other force, and we need to pressure Iran and Russia into backing reform in Syria. It's a great tragedy, in my view, that we missed the opportunity when we negotiated the nuclear deal with Iran to negotiate, to pin that to reform in Syria. We should have done, we didn't, but it's not too late. America and Iran do talk about the Syrian issue, are talking about the Syrian issue. We need to talk to Russia, we need to talk to Iran and really bring them on board, because I believe, it's my belief, that they can be persuaded to back reform in Syria. And I think we could see Bashar al-Assad go with Iran and Russia agreeing to that, if they would want some dignified way of removing him through perhaps NATO-supervised elections that brought in the whole diaspora of the Syrian community. There are ways it can be done as part of a negotiation. Transition, well, there are many mechanisms for transition. Actually, I favor a military council idea, which was being backed by the Saudis at one time, where you have a transitional caretaker government. But whatever you do, we need to have those conversations about ways forward with the Iranians and the Russians. We need to stop backing insurgents where we don't know who the insurgents are. We're being very, very dodgy about the way we behave. We need to stop the Turks bombing the PYD in northern Syria. I mean, the PYD are fighting Daesh, fighting ISIS. You may not like the PYD, but they are what they are there, and they actually, well, towns like Qamishli, they've brought stability to the area around there. We need to stop bombing them, bombing the people that are fighting ISIS. What's this? Our allies are bombing the people who are fighting ISIS. So we need to think about the Turks are a major problem. Sometimes I think we should actually remove the PKK from the terror list and shake the Turks up. The Turks are a major problem. Foreign fighters who go to fight with ISIS all go through Istanbul airport, present their passports, and then travel down to across the Syrian border and join up. And all of them. And Turkey has bought vast quantities of oil from ISIS. It pretends it's bombing ISIS. All it cares about is attacking the Kurds. I mean, Turkey, I never see why Turkey is considered such an asset in NATO. I think Turkey has been a burden since day one with the liberation of Iraq, but that's my opinion. But there are things we can do. I still don't understand why we can't take down some of these ISIS videos from YouTube. I mean, The American who's up there preaching away, okay, he's not ISIS, but they like him. Why is this? Why can't we get his stuff off YouTube? I don't understand. I don't understand what we're doing. But we should arm the Kurds. I'm sorry, we should arm the Kurds. It's what have they got? I was being told this morning. I mean, 1,000-kilometer frontier with ISIS, and they're fighting ISIS with small arms. We should arm them and stop messing around. There are people who are willing to fight, but we need to support the real people who are willing to fight. There is a future. But again, I think we need to care for the local population, the dispossessed, the displaced. People cannot live in squalor. I'll give you one example. We had an intern, a kid, I mentioned this morning to some friends. We had an intern who went to Turkey to work for a group called Shelter Box. Went into a Turkish refugee camp for Syrian refugees. And they had about 5,000 families living there. Well, it was winter, and they were in big Saudi tents, Saudi-provided tents, flimsy material. And in comes Shelter Box. They have 1,000 heavy canvas tents. The pathetic families in this camp burnt their Saudi tents down because they thought that was the best way of getting tents for their people. Burnt these tents down, and then there were only 1,000 decent Shelter Box tents, and then they start fighting amongst each other for the Shelter Box tents. The squalid conditions in the refugee camps, I mean, it's an international disgrace, really. So enough from me, but I do think we're not effective, and we need to be effective, and we need to be more compassionate and caring and think twice about how we handle our military action. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, William. Obviously, a lot of food for thought. Before, Tom, I'll turn to you to start our discussion. But let me just remind our viewers that you can send us your questions through Twitter, and the handle is @MideastPolicy. So please do send in any questions you have. We'll be monitoring that Twitter account. With that, Tom, let me turn it over to you and ask you to get us started on our questions.
I think my first question will be for Brian. You did testify before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee 4 or 6 weeks ago, and you noted that we've fallen short in our attempt to implement some of the basic pillars of our policy, one of them being training opposition forces. And we've just announced that we're abandoning one of those efforts altogether because it was so unsuccessful. But since this testimony, Russia has intervened in a big way and actually changed the situation on the ground. So do you think that this will galvanize, motivate some of our regional partners to be more focused on contributing and helping us with some of these pillars, namely training of ground forces that can do some of the work to change the dynamics on the ground and even help motivate the Assad regime to make concessions for the sake of a transitional government? Because the other big issue you have is that we can't deal with this without changing political structures in the Middle East and addressing grievances that motivate people. We have a better chance of doing that in Iraq than we do in Syria now, certainly. So that's really my question. Does the Russian intervention, is it a game changer in terms of motivating some of our partners to step up their game? Or are we going to have to deal with Russia and Iran and work out compromises with them? Because is their intervention going to be something that really inhibits our ability to carry out our policy.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. That's a great question. And I think the Russian engagement, still in its early stages, is seismic. And I think one of the first consequences it's likely going to contribute to is a major rallying cry and recruitment tool for the cause of Sunni extremism, like we've never seen before. And it may actually even rival the Iraq War in 2003, when the United States went in and essentially helped create a safe haven and a training ground. Just a few weeks into an air campaign largely by Russia, I see no discernible results in terms of their being able to create anything different than what William described in our own air campaign, to create structures that actually, in places where people feel like they're safer. I think that this mass of refugees that we've been hearing about and seeing when we go to Europe and other parts of the region, that flow will likely continue. So I think one immediate consequence of any outside actor that contributes additional force in this way, it's likely to accelerate the fragmentation. It's likely to continue the death and destruction that we've seen. And again, I noted this at the top, but it's important to remember, just in Syria, the vast majority of Syrians are killed by the Assad regime. That's why paint me skeptical about what our colleague said here about why not include Bashar al-Assad in this formula, himself, as a figure for transition. To your question of how otherwise regional partners will respond, I think it's interesting to watch what's been happening over the last couple of months. Some of the statements made publicly, including in the last day by Saudi officials, including the Foreign Minister Adel Jubeir, about Assad stepping down once a transition council is formed. And this is where the devil is in the details of discussion. Your question to me of, does the United States talk to Iran or Russia about this, felt to me like the felt to me like the question people asked in the Bush-Cheney administration of, should we do diplomacy with people that we don't like and disagree with and don't share their values? I almost feel like, you know, if the Iran nuclear deal, which I was a strong supporter of, did anything, I think it busted the myth that we can't somehow advance our own national security interests by talking with people. But the reality is, Tom, you know, I think many people in the United States government have been talking to Russia, including Secretary Kerry on down, about the Syria problem for years. And actions sometimes speak louder than words. I don't see, again, I don't have great faith and confidence in the way that Russia has also portrayed this to other actors. Recall that Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the UAE sent their top leaders to meet with Russia and Putin before the UN General Assembly and before Russia's engagement here. And based on what I've heard, none of this, in terms of the Russian actions, were signaled by the Russian leadership to those actors. So fine, have a conversation, but understand who we're dealing with. We're dealing with a regime itself in Russia that actually has used some of the most brutal tactics to try to crush terror. In my view, when you do that, you actually quite likely create more of it. So I'm all in favor of engagement, but not naive engagement. Similarly with Iran, there's been long-term, I think, discussions in the context and on the sidelines of the nuclear deal. I think the nuclear deal was the main event. It was a tough negotiation, I think, to be had. But to me, these outside actors, plus, and I'll close here, the regional actors, including the ones that I think are more reliable and trustworthy, like Jordan and the UAE and a few others, need to be part of some sort of conversation. But let's be clear, they're taking actions to reshape the battlefield. I don't think it'll succeed. It'll actually cause more death and destruction. And that's why it's my view, rather than the U.S. being passive and standing back here, notwithstanding the failures of trying to train some of the armed forces in some of the programs, I think we quite likely need to do more. But ultimately, it's not the outside actors that matter the most. The discussion that needs to be had, that is happening inside of Iraq, because there are structures there. There is a debate, you know, and again, I really regret. I understand why our friend from the KRG didn't come today. But that dialogue and discussion, I think, is important because it connects to the issue of power and how power might be decentralized. In Syria, we're, I think, not very close to that. My main point is that it can't be negotiated solely by outside powers. It needs to have those from the inside. And picking those who are the right representatives of the key centers of power has been at the crux of the problem inside of Syria. We've had some very capable diplomats, some of your former colleagues, involved with this for years. And it's hard to figure out when a society is in meltdown who are the legitimate representatives of different factions. But I'll state my view clearly here, is that when there are factions that have murdered literally thousands of their own people in Syria, they're quite likely not to have not only the moral credibility, but then also the political staying power and any reconceived, decentralized, negotiated sense of governance in Syria. It's quite likely that you'll have more blowback and opposition from other sides of the conflict, that you won't be able to get even the start of a conversation. And I think we've had some false starts, like Geneva 2, and I do think that we need to have these discussions, but we need to be honest about who's doing what to whom. And I think remembering that fundamental inside of Syria, that the vast majority of people have been killed by this regime.
Well, when I speak about our partners in the region stepping up their game, it's not only contributing ground forces or training ground forces. There are a lot of elements to the policies that they need to be implementing against ISIS. That means stopping the flow of money, and discrediting the ideology, and stopping the flow of fighters. So, again, does Russia motivate them to do more there? And when it comes to choosing people who may be appropriate in a transitional Syrian government, do they know these people better than we do? And have we been listening to them when we've been trying to vet people? And can they do more to help us determine who should and should not be part of a future political structure in Syria? Mm-hmm. Turkey is blaming ISIS for the bombing in Ankara last week. Saudi Arabia has serious concerns about ISIS, at least domestically. Jordan has concerns about them on its border. So they all ought to be highly motivated. Are they going to be now?
I mean, I think this is the key question, if it's back to me. I mean, on those other lines of effort, I suspect that it depends on which country you're talking about, but I suspect that those countries in the region that are part of our anti-ISIS coalition, that oppose Iran and that oppose Russia, when they see them acting aggressively, it's not likely that it's going to motivate them to do more to cut off funding to extremist groups. The sorts of actions that we all know happened after the September 2013 non-strike event, when the United States and others threatened the use of force in reaction to chemical weapons, and then all the sorts of funding flows from private actors, perhaps from some countries in the region, to a range of extremist groups. And let's be clear also, this was convenient for the Assad regime too, which let out many of these extremists from jail and let what was a peaceful opposition that they tried to crush brutally, they helped contribute to the radicalization of it. In an ideal world, the U.S. would actually try to work with a core member of the coalition. We've got 60 plus countries with different capabilities, but some, are more active and visible in the air campaigns. Some are more active in the counter-radicalization campaigns. I just came back from Morocco last week, and Morocco and what it's doing on the countering violent extremism. Even though it's far away in North Africa, it's using these tools that I think William and others have talked about, these other key components. But your question in this moment in October, in reaction to the last couple of weeks, Maybe you'll see some diplomatic moves on the part of some of the actors like Saudi Arabia. Maybe these signals will demonstrate a new conception, and maybe Russia will come to its wits in Iran, that doubling down on a failed regime that kills its citizens repeatedly is a formula for greater terrorism and disaster, maybe. But let's be clear about and not naive about that negotiation. That's why I think some of the signals even the U.S. sent in reaction to the first wave of bombing by Russia and some of the gestures we made demonstrated a little bit of, hey, we didn't really see this coming. And we have to be clear about that. So, you know, and on Turkey, and maybe William can jump in here too as well, they're a difficult ally. I mean, they're a NATO ally. We've seen for years, as I said at the top, that they clearly made the regime change of Assad and the Kurdish issue a higher priority than they did Sunni extremism, whether it's ISIS, the Jabhat al-Nusra, or other things. That's why when we talk about safe zones in particular places, or when others talk about no-fly zones, which is the new vogue for Republican candidates and some Democratic candidates, the devil is in the details of how you actually implement that. The U.S. can't do that in northern Syria without a viable partner that we trust. And that's been part of the extended negotiation here. My fear, Tom, and I'll close here, is that I think the fracturing and fragmentation that we've seen, especially in Syria, with great contribution and resources from the region, is quite likely to continue unless, you know, we have a wake-up call from all of the parties here. I think the President Obama has been wise. He doesn't want to make the conflict in Syria a Russia-U.S. standoff. We've been a little bit slow, I think, to recognize what Russia's actions are likely to produce on the ground. I'll close with sort of where I think, again, my end state that's likely in Syria is a negotiated, decentralized system of governance. Perhaps, if one wants to look for silver linings in what Russia has been done in the last few weeks, it could lead to a sense of areas that are closer affiliated with the Assad regime, and then other areas that could be controlled by other opposition forces. You can get to some semblance. Perhaps, the reason why I say perhaps is that the structure of the conflict in Syria is so fragmented. Even these maps we see in the news and in the press betray sort of the neighborhood by neighborhood sense of who controls what, and the fragmentation that is going on here. But I think ultimately, I mean, my view is that in reaction to the Russian actions, the U.S. needs to redouble its efforts with the coalition, but it also needs to keep that door open for diplomacy, because ultimately, you know, that diplomacy is the only pathway to stabilizing the country, but we have to be realistic about who we're dealing with.
Well, William, can you comment? But before you do, just one thing you touched on here, which I'd like to stress, is that some of our partners in the region, when they see the Russian intervention on behalf of Syria, which is a client of Iran, are going to be doubly concerned about how this facilitates Iranian expansion in the Arab world, and are going to be as concerned about how this props up the Assad regime as they are about anything else, which can influence how they deal with Islamic State, how seriously focused they are on that. William, do you want to talk about, you said that we need to pressure Russia and Iran to bring about political change in Syria. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, as I see it, you should be aware, we are aware, I think, but Russia and Iran are cooperating now in Syria in a new way we haven't seen before, because every commander of every Al-Quds force commander responsible for the Syrian issue, and the Syrian issue is in the hands of the Al-Quds force in Iran. Every Al-Quds force commander responsible for the Syrian issue is in Syria now. There is a major ground campaign led by Iran. People have always talked about Iran fighting in Syria. Not really. There were a few people there, a few units. It was small scale. But Iran is making a big push at the moment. My fear, actually, is that this could expand into a wider regional war. I mean, it may be ridiculous to say this, but it's a little bit frightening. You have a situation where countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey on one side face off Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah on the other side. And where are their war zones? Where are they playing? Where are they? Well, they're not playing, they're fighting. Bloody wars in Libya, Yemen, Syria, Iraq. These are war zones now. Everybody's supporting different factions, but in some instances actually physically bombing. It's not good. I suppose the one bright light on the horizon in a perverted sort of sense is ISIS, because ISIS hates all of them. ISIS hates Saudi Arabia, ISIS hates Iran, ISIS is a common enemy for the lot of them, so maybe the fight against ISIS will stop a wider regional war. We are in danger of a wider regional war. Iran is in the ascendancy. Iran is a major power in the Middle East that is increasing its strength. That's partly America. I mean, we've made deals with Iran that have taken pressure off Iran. And I think perhaps we were right to do so, but nonetheless, we have a new geopolitical situation in the Middle East with a stronger Iran that's going to sell as much oil as it can sell and is going to be playing a bigger and bigger role. Yeah, we need to talk to Iran. We can't not, well, we are talking to Iran, but we need to talk to Iran seriously about Syria, putting the right kind of pressure on Iran, and putting the right kind of pressure on Russia. This is much more important than our squabble with Russia over Ukraine. I'm sorry, I don't mean to say that we should sacrifice Ukraine in some way, but this is the issue that will affect world peace and world stability. And so we really must take it to heart. It can affect the future of the world, this whole mess in the Middle East now. We don't want to see a wider war, and there is a risk that we might see a wider war.
Brian?
If I could just add a friendly amendment to what William just said here, and it's truly a friend, just to demonstrate the complexity of the conflict right now. You mentioned Egypt on one side of this conflict. What's interesting, especially since Russia started its campaign, is that Egypt, including as recently as yesterday, has signaled its support for the Russian bombing campaign in a way that contrasts it with Saudi Arabia and others that have actually financially backed them over the last 2 or 3 years. It's an interesting dimension, and I lay it out there because it demonstrates your broader point, which is these complex, arrangements between countries in the region. So in a sense, if Egypt does come out in favor of some sort of negotiated solution via Russia, and Russia's leaned towards the Assad regime and propping it up a bit, or whatever its game is here, and is also in the camp of Iran, it presents a quite curious point, I think, for the Egyptian state itself, a state that, in essence, is surviving on the financial support of countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who are part of the anti-ISIS and also anti-Assad coalition.
Absolutely.
Any questions from our guests? Or
I do have 2 questions, if I could, please, Tom. The first one is, none of you mentioned a role for the United Nations. I know perhaps the United Nations is not the most popular forum, but certainly when the United States closed its embassy in Damascus, followed by many other Western countries in 2011, or maybe 2012, we lost our ability to communicate with the Syrian government directly to a large extent, and to any other opposition who might remain in Syria at the time. The UN, starting with Kofi Annan through Lakhdar Brahimi and now Staffan de Mistura, have always maintained contacts with the Syrian government, with Iran, with all the players involved. Whenever their proposals come up, they sort of receive lukewarm support from the Security Council. And I think this might be one of the reasons, frankly, why this problem has taken such a tailspin, because we don't support the UN representative. It's very hard to see how you're going to come to an agreement which will bring progress. But is not now time, given the fact that it was the P5+1 which negotiated this very difficult agreement with Iran, would it not be appropriate perhaps to try and get another P5+2 or 3, including Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and others, to form try and bring on UN auspices, bring that about as a diplomatic forum, or try to bring some sort of resolution to some of these political matters which just sort of stand our way to bring this crisis to a...
Well, certainly, I think if there is diplomacy and the Saudis and others are excluded from it, they're going to object pretty strongly. They didn't like being excluded from the nuclear negotiations. And it's really, I'm having a hard time in envisioning what kind of agreement we can get with Russia and Iran when our geopolitical interests are so different. When our clearly the Assad regime, in our view, has lost legitimacy and can't be part of a long-term transitional arrangement there. And it's viewed that way by our regional partners. So I would think they would have to be there to have some assurance that they weren't being left aside and wouldn't have a say in it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think I support the UN getting engaged here. I think if you look at what happened at the UN General Assembly and the discussions last month, it's not that it wasn't discussed. It's what's a viable pathway at this moment. And if you talk to the stream of UN envoys that you mentioned, who all have very distinguished backgrounds, and Stefan de Mistura, I think, these efforts to negotiate localized ceasefires and the theory of you can de-escalate the conflict in certain places, I think is an interesting one, but it hasn't yet produced a change in the structure of the overall conflict. It may help, maybe, a few communities and a few people, and we shouldn't devalue that, right? Because starting from where I was at the beginning is that, you know, one of my key metrics is what do we do to stop the loss of human life, in addition to stabilizing the region. And the UN has done tremendous work also in responding to the refugee and displaced crisis. But I've always seen it in the context, I also did work a couple of years ago on the problem of Libya. I was appointed to a UN panel by Ban Ki-moon on Libya. So I've placed a tremendous amount of value in the expertise in the institution. But what I also witnessed at that moment in Libya was what was happening on the ground and what other actors inside of Libya and then regional actors were doing mattered a lot more at that moment than what the UN was trying to do. That doesn't mean we should suspend what it's trying to do. What I'm suggesting, and I think I tried to say in my statement, but then also in my recent testimonies and articles, is that whatever actions Russia is taking, Iran, regional actors, the US, it all should be driven towards how do you actually have a negotiated political settlement. And quite obviously, the UN is one of the few institutions and actors that has the skills, the experience, and the knowledge to make that happen. But the key, Mark, is what precisely are we talking about at this point?
So, Art, do you want to comment on your view of a political transition in Syria?
I think it's very important to count and to run numbers of who killed how many and who killed more than who. That's very important, but it's not a priority. The priority now is to make sure that no more people will die, or much less people will die today, tomorrow, and in the future. Because meanwhile, when we're counting, people are dying, people are being displaced, people are suffering. They don't have heating in the winter, they don't have food, they don't have anything. They're losing everything. So, yes, I understand, but then I go back to what I said previously. Foreign policy was about regime change. Fine, fair enough. But please, there has to be a time limit. We have to give 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. We put all our efforts to change this regime. But at some point, we have to say that this did not work. And we have to be pragmatic and try to work on something else. The whole point of finding a solution is to put around the table people who hate each other, people who went to war against each other, to have them talk and talk again and sit again and negotiate again and maybe disagree and maybe then agree on a political transition, on a regime and opposition government, and on a gradual transition. I think that's the only solution.
Well, but then specifically, who in the regime stays and who in the regime leaves?
That's for the Syrian people to decide. I mean, the international community has a duty to make all the parties who are fighting each other in Syria to sit around the table. It's a duty that the international community has. And then these people will decide all together.
But I don't understand if a government is dropping barrel bombs on entire families and neighborhoods. And I'm just trying to understand it if I were a Syrian. I'm an American analyst. And I just don't see much credibility in the proposition you offer there. If, you said we put all of our efforts to change this regime. No, we didn't. If we really wanted to change this regime, we could. And they could have, and the United States has, and the coalition.
The question is why?
No.
Why did you not?
It was not. It was not
Why
a
did you
priority.
not?
It was not a priority.
Why not?
It was not a priority, because all of the concerns about the lessons we should have learned from the Iraq War and what happens when you collapse a regime.
Yeah.
But the proposition that you offer, that it's still there after 3 or 4 years because, again, we didn't put all of our efforts into it, but it's still there because it's murdered its own people. The people you know very well has murdered its own citizens, and it says, we're still here, we're legitimate, and you're telling me that, you're going to sit and go to somebody, if you're in the U.S. government, and say, okay, Syrian opposition, despite the fact that they kill innocent children, and the vast majority, because the numbers matter. You want to dismiss the numbers and who's doing what? It matters for the sake of structuring diplomacy that actually would achieve. And I don't understand what you're actually proposing here, because it wouldn't bring anybody to the table.
Clear. I'm proposing to make your mind. The West has to make his mind. Regime change or being pragmatic. It's not my problem if you didn't put all your.
But it is your problem that the regime of Syria has murdered its own
just
citizens.
a minute. One thing, Brian. I mean,
Yeah.
you have a civil war. We've seen civil wars in Libya. We've seen civil war in Iraq. We've seen civil war everywhere. Yes, the Syrian government have slaughtered huge numbers, but there are huge numbers also killed by the insurgents of the
No
various
doubt.
factions
No
of
doubt.
insurgents.
Yeah.
And it's a bloody, brutal conflict.
Right.
And we have not been that interested in resolving it. I mean, you go back. We were talking about the UN. I mean, the UN issue. The United Nations has been disempowered. We had negotiations, Geneva I, Geneva II. They were ineffective and useless. Why? Because we didn't allow Iran to be part of those negotiations. They are, if you like, the enemy. If they're on the other side in this war.
Yeah.
I mean, we're being pragmatic now. We're dealing with Iran, and America is being pragmatic, and maybe it's very sensible. You talk about almost every nation in the Middle East. There have been terrible killings. I mean, not everyone, but there are many nations in the Middle East where there have been terrible killings going on by various factions.
Right.
Some of them destabilized, you could argue, by us. I mean, we made a bigger mess in Libya, and we haven't sorted it out. So all I'm trying to say is it's time to talk peace. It's time to talk solutions, and we need to talk with our enemies. Not talking to our enemies, we can't have a solution. And having said, okay, so we don't like Bashar al-Assad. We would like to see him go. I personally would agree with you that
But
that's
it's not
part of
about
the
us.
solution.
It's not about us. It's not about
But
whether
it
we
is
like
about
or
us
dislike.
because we are the big players.
It's the Syrian people. And when
Syrian people
are run out of their country and murdered
Yeah.
every day.
Right. Well, so now how can the Syrian people decide unless there is some stability imposed by the international community who are the big players
Right.
in this game?
Right.
It's you all very well saying the Syrian people are going to solve this. The Syrian people are going to choose. The Syrian people must choose their future.
Yeah.
Fine.
Yeah.
But First, we have to make a deal that results in some sort of end to the killing.
Yes.
I mean, you
Agreed.
can't have
Agreed.
this go on, and that means you have to negotiate. You have to talk to these people. You have to talk to Iran. And yes, I think part of the deal is that Bashar al-Assad should go. Who comes in? I mean, I don't mind. There are many models. There's the model that Siwa mentioned, power sharing with opposition, and there's the model of a transition military council. There are many models. I don't give a damn. What we need is the discussion, and we're not serious about that. And every time, if we want the UN to do it, we have to empower the UN to do it, and we're not empowering the UN to do it.
Right, William, but when you say you don't give a damn, that demonstrates to me a lack of clarity about the actual proposed solution. And this is where I think the real conversation is, and should be. If you don't give a damn about who's invited, and pointing to something you just said 2 minutes ago, I agree, Iran should have been part of that conversation. We should give a damn. If we want to be really serious about a political solution, you actually need to be very precise about who is best suited to actually be at that table. It's not just, okay, everybody, let's come together. Because if you end up inviting individuals or factions, and I mean no disrespect to anyone, but people who then are viewed to have actually engaged in war crimes or a lack of legitimacy. And that's where I think the real trick is again, as I stated, you want Syrian government institutions to be intact. You want individuals who know the country, who know how to run ministries and other things. This is where the real discussion should go. But it also needs to actually talk about that melange of different opposition groups, and many of whom are self-appointed. We have a lot of self-appointed people in a process where a country is actually fragmenting and breaking down. And that, I think, is, we should make it a priority. I don't think regime change, transition and transformation that's negotiated is where I think you and I agree. My main point is that we need to be very precise about what that means, not that we don't care what the process or the conversation should be, because a bad conversation could actually lead to further distrust and then also actions that destabilize the situation.
Any player should be invited. That's my opinion. Any player.
If I may jump in here a bit, Suwar, the problem with the proposition you make of the Syrian people will decide this is that much depends on the balance of power on the ground at the point where you have such discussions. And here Brian's point about who has killed how many is relevant. If the war stopped today and the Syrian factions on the ground met, given Iran and Russia and Hezbollah's support to the Assad regime would have the upper hand, and the bulk of the Syrian people would have no way of imposing their interest on such a discussion. And somehow Assad would be able to maneuver himself.
So what's the
into being
alternative? To continue the war? What's the alternative? To let this war last?
The alternative is to consider what's happening on the ground. Right now, Russian intervention is changing the strategic balance on the ground in favor of the regime. And they are doing this very deliberately. If you don't change this militarily, or you don't come to an agreement with the Russians to stop what they are doing and put some pressure on Assad rather than help him, then you would be guaranteeing a result that's pro-regime.
But the United States is a great power. They can talk to the Russians. They can reach a solution with the Russians. I'm sure they can.
The Russians have beaten the U.S. at the game of chicken. They've stepped in with their forces before the U.S. could step in for its side. And therefore the Russians are ahead in the game, and I have no confidence in this administration being able to play power politics with Putin right now.
Then what do? We wait 1.5 years for a new president?
I think Mark's suggestion of not a traditional UN role, but a P5+1 type formula is quite relevant. And I think it will be part of the solution. It will be the framework. But once the guns have fallen silent, and right now the Russians will not stop and the Iranians will not stop until they have guaranteed a slice of Syria that includes all the major urban centers and that protects access to the sea and to the Lebanese border for the Assad regime. So let's be conscious of the power play that's going on right now and of who's winning.
If I could comment on that, I think that's right, but let's also be conscious of the broader sort of field of play here. Russia has gotten very good press and attention in the last 4 or 5 weeks, but when you look at where Russia's position is strategically across the region, and you compare it to what the United States has and its alliances and its partnerships across the broader region, and I'm not going to dispute you and your assertion about this administration. What I'm saying is structurally and strategically. Russia is actually trying to claw back inside of Syria from a position of weakness, and that it intervened when Assad, I think, was seen to be weaker and they needed the support. Broader than Syria and inside of Iraq, but then importantly in the Gulf and even in places like North Africa. The conception that Russia is even close to being the U.S. rival when it comes to partnerships and networks. Again, what we have in place over decades. Not particular to this administration, because I'm not going to challenge you on sort of U.S. policy versus Russia in the Middle East with the Obama administration, but structurally, if you look at not only Israel, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt still to this day, despite tensions in the relationship, all of these countries are much more closer, and I think potentially more closer to the U.S. point of view structurally. Inside of Russia, inside of Syria, I don't think Russia has a clear plan for what it is doing at this point. I think it's trying to salvage the Assad regime and gain a foothold, but there are limits, my main point, to how far it could actually project its power. Certainly the Jordanians are not looking favorably to its intervention. Turkey, also, when it's seen sort of the Russian fighters coming up to its borders. My main point is that though America's conversation seems strategically constrained in the Middle East right now because we haven't done that much, and we've failed, I think, for the last decade or so to have anything but a tactical and reactive posture. We moved from a policy of dual containment of Iran and Iraq to something that contributed to today's chaos. We're still structurally in a better position to respond. Doesn't answer the problem of Syria, right? The real discussion should be about, I think, the U.S., Russia, plus the region, talking about what can we do to effectuate a transition, to move all of this talk into real action.
But it brings us back to your testimony before the Senate, when you made recommendations about course corrections, and it brings us back to my first question. Because Nabil is saying the situation on the ground favors Russia and Iran temporarily.
Temporarily.
Just in the last weeks, Syria has made advances that it wasn't making before the Russian intervention. So do you see any commitment on the part of the people you were speaking to on the Hill, or the administration, or our partners, to be more aggressive about the policy we say is our policy, and change the situation on the ground so that we can get a diplomatic solution that's more satisfying to us than the one we could get right now if we went to the table right now?
Frankly, on the Hill, I don't see much consensus to be had, unfortunately. I see a lot of concern and complaints about the current policy. Nobody thinks the current policy is optimal, but it is nothing like what I saw in 2006 or 2008, where you had clear opposition to the Bush administration's Iraq policy that built a consensus that was strong within one of the parties and even got some bipartisan consensus. The fact, and as I said before, the fact that we don't even have an authorization for the use of force is a signal that there's really no political will in the members of Congress to deal with this. Your question on whether the administration is focusing on this, at the highest levels, I mean, look, you can assess President Obama's appearances on 60 Minutes and his press conference and how he characterized his reactions to Russia's engagement in the Middle East. I don't see, my interpretation of that plus other things is I don't see any major strategic shifts on the horizon, quite frankly, when it comes to Syria. And a big part of it is, and this is where sadly most of the American public is, and I think people from outside of the United States can come and say, well, the U.S. is the great power and it can do this and that. Well, guess what? When it comes to a lot of issues in the Middle East, Republican or Democrat, there's not much inclination to get deeply engaged in these conflicts that have, I think, animated much of the region, to get caught in the middle of this. I think that's wrong. I actually think the U.S. should probably lean in here with a much more effective response. But to answer your question, I fear that sort of this status quo policy, not that we won't change things. Clearly, we're doing more with Kurdish forces in northern Syria, and clearly we'll see some activity there. I don't know if any of those tactical shifts will change the structure of the conflict towards what I think there's consensus about, the need for there to be a political solution. You know, and every time I think there's a wake-up call, whether it's a 3-year-old boy face down in the surf, or these migrants packed into a truck in Hungary, just the basic, or the barrel bombs that are dropped on people inside of Syria. People who just want to line up and get bread, and their own government bombs them and kills them. Every time I think there should be a wake-up call that strikes our moral outrage and then our strategic conscience, it just doesn't happen. It doesn't lead to, and I think part of it is this post-Iraq war hangover, that people fear that any step that we take, whether it's a no-fly zone or a safe zone, could lead to a slippery slope that gets us back to where we were in 2005 and 2006.
William?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of points. We have to be careful all the time about occupying the moral high ground. You know, our allies are barrel bombing. We've seen the barrel bombing of Fallujah Hospital, for instance, and I'm sorry, but that's our allies doing that. So you know, and there have been a number of similar instances. Russia, we can bring them to the table. We can. I mean, they are hurting. The economic sanctions on Russia are really hurting. They're in a lot of pain at the moment. So we have stuff that we can offer Russia to help bring Russia to heel. They want Crimea in a way. I mean, why not? I mean, it's basically was historically theirs, and let's move on. And models. You were right, Brian, to say I should. Okay, my favored model for the future of Syria, let me be clear, is that I think that we need some sort of negotiated end to the war, and then we need an election imposed on Syria that takes in all of the diaspora, not just those that have Syrian embassies or whatever, everybody in the camps, everybody in the wider Syrian diaspora, everywhere. UN polling stations set up every country where anybody who has Syrian heritage and a Syrian birth certificate or a Syrian passport or a Syrian ID card can come forward and vote, and then we might see a fair result. And I believe that with the right kind of pressure on Iran and Russia, we could bring them on board for that type of solution. I think it's the only type of solution, actually, and then the transitional government, while we're waiting for those elections, after we have imposed some sort of stability as best we can, that transitional government, I don't mind whether it's a military council or a shared whatever opposition in coalition or whatever you call it. And at the end, we were talking about ISIS. And I mean, we're gathered here to talk about Daesh or ISIS or ISIL.
Yeah.
We need that conversation. We need to bring everybody on board, the Russians, the Iranians, and we have to deliver our part. We have to actually rein in Turkey. That's one of the major diplomatic moves that's needed in order to put an end to ISIS expansionism, because it is dangerous. It's massively dangerous. We're kind of diverting into talking about Bashar al-Assad, but the reason we're here is to talk about ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, and it's a real threat to the wider region, and it's one we ignore at our peril, because we could see, heaven knows, there are enough people in the wider Sunni world, including young men in Saudi Arabia, who are loyal to ISIS, and heaven knows if we ignore this problem, and we're in real danger.
Yeah. Question
Yes.
to Sawar. Sawar, in your presentation, you stressed the connection between ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood,
Yes.
a linkage for which there is no evidence that I'm aware of. But you mentioned nothing about the linkage between Bashar al-Assad and ISIS, a linkage for which there is much evidence. Why is that?
I have not seen any evidence of linkage between Bashar al-Assad and Daesh. Daesh is killing Syrian soldiers. It doesn't make sense. It's not reasonable to think that there is any linkage. Do I have any linkage with someone who's trying to kill me and who kill my people?
Well, you said it was a complicated relationship, and in fact,
I
the
talked about the
confrontation-
business. Yeah, I talked about the business relationship. Yes, the business relationship between the Kurds and ISIS, between the Turks and ISIS, between the Syrians and ISIS, of course. But in the same time,
You mean buying oil?
buying oil, but in the same time, the Syrian government is paying salaries for 4 years now and a half to civil servants in the city of Raqqa, a city totally 100% controlled by ISIS.
Why do you think?
Why do I think? Because it's trying to remain a state with its institutions. It's trying to show the world that it is a state.
Well, without going into details, I mean, but you should look into this further, is that the linkages between Bashar al-Assad and ISIS go back to the foundation of ISIS and go back to the relationship between the Assad regime and the infiltration of foreign fighters into Iraq to fight American soldiers there. That linkage has been well established. If you're not aware of it, we can discuss it off camera afterwards. The other linkage is the release of ISIS leaders from Bashar's jails, just as things were heating up between him and the opposition. And the reason there is that he wanted to have ISIS there to say it's to the West, it's either me or the terrorists. So he played a clever game there, and more or less it's working for him.
Well,
The
even-
linkages are very
Even if it was the case, I'm not sure about this, I'm not aware of what you're saying, but even if it was the case, even if it was true, we need to do something about it today. We need to be pragmatic today. And being pragmatic is to choose, do we want a regime change or do we want a real solution? If we want a real solution, I'm sorry, but we cannot exclude anybody.
Including Bashar al-Assad in a discussion of transition is one thing,
Yes.
and choosing between him and ISIS is something else. If you're implying that we need to choose, either have ISIS dominate Syria or Bashar al-Assad dominate Syria, then this is not a choice.
I've never implied this. I'm only talking about transition. I'm not talking about...
Transition is not a problem.
Yeah.
I mean, you can, but the problem is getting to a point where the balance of power allows both sides to have a strong negotiating position.
It is, I mean, Nabil, you're right. I mean, and you're right in some ways about your historical issues. The Ba'ath Party, every ISIS general is a Ba'ath general, and of course Syria is ruled by the Ba'ath Party. But of course, there have been, for decades, there have been divisions between Iraqi Ba'ath and Syrian Ba'ath. But it's a complex issue. But there are historical roots there. I mean, those doubtless the generals in the Syrian army will know generals in ISIS because they're all old Baathists, and that's true. But having said that, we need a way forward. Siwa's right, and it's my opinion that the symbolic issue of Bashar al-Assad going is vastly important. That's my opinion. I think, and then the question is transition, how we handle this, and so forth. But we still must remember that the big crisis is ISIS. I mean, it is a big crisis. We can see the whole Middle East turned into a war zone. It's heading that way. And if we just ignore the ISIS issue, then we're in real trouble here.
Absolutely, I agree with that. In any transition, and here I'm going to get ahead of ourselves way too much, but I think it should be part of the discussion, is that any transition in Syria needs to have a discussion about justice, accountability, and holding people to account for their war crimes, including the regime, but then those actors like ISIS as well. Because if it's simply about a negotiation over power and who sits in what seats, then that's the first step, obviously. But if it doesn't include this sense of somebody has brutalized whole communities, somebody has, and much of this is recorded, right? People are watching this, and I think there's been the use of not only drones for surveillance to examine the security situation, but a lot of hands are bloody. And I actually think there's an opportunity in a place like Syria, which wasn't seized in Iraq or has not been seized in Libya and other places, to have that conversation about holding people to account for those crimes. Crimes that are playing out today, but crimes that played out years ago as well.
Any final comments? I think we're closing in on the appointed hour. You want to make a
Well,
final
I've got one final comment on that point, actually. I mean, just cast back a few years to 2003 and the liberation of Iraq. The State Department had good committees working here. One of them was on a kind of truth and reconciliation. And it was Iraqi-led. It was an Iraqi committee of Iraqi opposition, and they did great work on a truth and reconciliation committee for Iraq. And then the Defense Department took over and just binned that. I kind of favor, I mean, there is blood on so many hands. Bashar al-Assad, so many hands. Maliki, God knows where we're going to stop. What I would favor is, personally, is revisiting that idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. I do agree we need to look at justice, but we have to be a little careful about retribution, because it can create new grievances, as it did in Iraq, because there is this sense of, part of what motivates these Sunnis is this sense of we're the victims here, and I just want to put in that pitch for a Truth and Reconciliation.
Freudian slip. So shall we end on a Freudian slip? Well, gentlemen, thank you all very much. It's been a very interesting discussion, obviously very different points of view. Hopefully we have contributed to this discussion, which will obviously continue after this. But thank you all for your insights and for sharing your views, and we look forward to gathering again for our next conference in a few months. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.
Good.
Now we can turn the air conditioning back
Oh
on.
my God. I feel like I'm in the Middle East.
Kind
Yeah.
of a good discussion, actually.
I guess everybody is thirsty.
Very much.
And I couldn't move
How are you doing?
for the camera.
Well, thanks. I've been
Thank you very much.
busy in various things. This is one of them.
I would love
I've
to.
also been
Yes, thank
mentoring
you
the
very much.
ambassadorial
Thank you.
seminar at the State Department, which has been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Because what happens is when they...
Would you like to have some?
Sure. Thank you.
When they train, they let the ambassadors go through this training course, and many of them are my friends.
Oh, yeah,
Of course,
yeah.
They
Yeah.
group right behind me.
Yeah.
So that's been fun. I do that again starting next week.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Well,
Weeks.
Good,
it's really
So
incredible.
no, it's been
to do something
nice, I
like
must
that.
say. The
Yes,
pace
it
of
was very
retirement,
valuable.
the pace of being in the NEA front office. And so that's been fun. Actually, I heard yesterday from Robert Ford,
Very
who's
nice,
now up
yeah.
in Vermont, but I
Yeah,
want to
yeah,
try to get him to come back. I guess he said he and Jim Jeffrey just
Go
visited
to a member of the
Iraq,
Congress
and-
to
Right.
help
and
with
they,
reserving a room.
weren't too discouraged, he
And
said.
Yeah.
Congress
Yeah,
was
yeah.
I mean, it's not great, but it wasn't maybe the total
So they-
disaster.